Hi, art seekers. We tend to call artists rock stars when we really admire their work, and that is absolutely true for the work of the artist that we are talking to today. However, he is also a legitimate rock star, so even more exciting. Thank you so much, and welcome, Brandon Boyd. And I think it's really interesting when musicians are also visual artists because there's so much crossover between those two forms.
Yeah, I think so too. There's a handful of musicians over the years. Hey man,
How you doing?
how are you?
Good.
There's a handful of musicians over the years that have expressed themselves visually, whether in painting or illustration, but also in like film and video and photography. And I've always found it fascinating because listening to music by itself, if you really sort of dig in with any particular artist or band, there's this cool opportunity to actually listen to decisions that were being made. Or if you're watching them live, you're watching these decisions being made right before your eyes. And a lot of them are sort of psychically communicated amongst each other. And it's a beautiful form of communication. I actually think it's a sort of high form of communication. But you are quite literally watching them you're watching their brains work. And so when you have the opportunity to see artists who are visually expressive as well, you have another sort of doorway into those little creative decisions that they're making. I've always found it fascinating.
And I'm sure those creative inroads are even complicated more when you work in collaborations. And I know this work here is a collaborative piece with Diana Garcia, and you've done another collaboration. And I'm wondering how you pick a person who would be appropriate to work with and how that ends up informing the aesthetic of the work.
That's a good question. Most of the time, I haven't done that many collaborations. Most of them have been born of friendships and people that I'm close to in my life. So Diana Garcia is a very close friend. She said, "We have a whole wall. Do you want to do a mural with me?" That's me doing a Mexican accent. Sorry. And I was like, "Of course." And so we had a lot of reference points that her and I had been kind of geeking out over. And we did a little sketch together. We did a couple that were kind of fun, and then we just started going for it. And it was fun. We had both become kind of fascinated with woodblock art. Yeah, so we wanted to do something that sort of appeared like it was in woodblocking, but we did it with paint pens and freehand. I'm surprised it's lasted as long as it has, especially like in Venice. Sort of most art in Venice has a sort of a brief lifespan.
Sure. Well, that's part of what makes street art so exciting, is it has such a fluidity.
Yeah, that's true. And I think as artists, and if you're painting on a wall, it's like you're pouring yourself into a process that you know is only going to last for a short period of time. But it's like this sort of beautiful ephemera that you're like pouring yourself into, and you're like, as you're doing it, you're like, goodbye.
Right now, when you're working outdoors, you use these paint pens.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about one day transitioning to other materials?
I've taken paint pens and illustration pens, design markers about as far as I can take them, I think. And I've actually been more recently interested for the past 2 years or so in watercolor. And loosening up my style a little bit. It's been very educational and frustrating and wonderful all at the same time. There's a lack of control in watercolor that's become very fascinating to me. And I've done my best to control it, but then the times when it just starts to kind of bleed into a sketch that you spent so much time on, it's like, no, stop! And you try and, stop it with your fingers and swabs and things, and then you realize that, oh, maybe this is a beautiful mistake. Maybe there aren't any mistakes in this process.
Well, when you work in a gallery or a more traditional context, is there a different energy than when you work on the street and in a mural format?
The stuff that I've been lucky enough to have presented in galleries and in art shows and stuff, I do in the sort of quiet of my home studio, and where I'm a very sort of single-minded atmosphere and by myself and alone in every capacity, And when I've done stuff on walls in more public spaces, it's arguably a little bit more fun if that makes sense, because there's people around, and you know, you're like listening to music together.
To me, there can be something very static about work that's in a gallery or
Yeah.
produced in a traditional way. Obviously, not all the time and not with all work, but there's just something so energetic and dynamic and authentic about work that is done in conjunction with so many other sounds and things.
Because you know, everything that we hear and that we see ends up informing the process in some way, shape, or form, even if it's unconsciously. If you're painting in silence in your studio, what you're doing is going to turn out very differently, as far as I've observed at least. It can turn out very differently than if you're painting outside with all of these sort of urban noises, painting like on the top of a hill or a forest. It's all going to be a little bit different or a lot different, depending on what you're doing.
What would your street moniker be if you worked illegally?
That's a good question. Uncle Baba. That's what, we're standing in front of Zen Bun Chocolate here in Venice, and their daughter refers to me as Uncle Baba, so I think that's going to be my everything from now on.